I signed the divorce papers without arguing because some victories arrived disguised as surrender. The courthouse doors swung open behind me as the cool October air rolled across the granite steps, carrying away the last echoes of a marriage that had already been dead long before a judge made it official. Olivia never looked back. She walked beside Nathan Cole with the kind of confidence that only comes from believing the future belongs entirely to you. Nathan held the passenger door of his brand-new black Bentley, smiling like a man who had just won the greatest prize of his life. Olivia laughed, slipped her sunglasses over her eyes, and rested her hand on his arm as photographers from a local business magazine happened to capture the moment. They wanted the perfect picture of Boston's newest power couple. They got it. What they did not capture was me standing quietly 20 feet away with no anger on my face and no bitterness in my voice. My assistant, Claire Bennett, approached carrying a leather portfolio and a tablet. She had attended every court hearing without saying more than a handful of words. People probably assumed she was simply handling paperwork. They had no reason to think otherwise. Claire stopped beside me and waited. She knew I never liked making important decisions while emotions were still loud. I watched the Bentley disappear into downtown traffic before finally speaking. Take everything from them. Claire did not blink. She did not ask whether I was certain. She simply nodded once and answered, "Understood, sir." Then she opened the portfolio, checked a single item already prepared on the first page, and quietly walked toward the waiting town car. Watching her leave, I almost smiled. The strange thing about power is that it rarely announces itself. It simply moves while everyone else is distracted by the spotlight. I climbed into my pickup truck instead of following the luxury cars heading toward the financial district. The truck was 7 years old. The driver's seat showed signs of honest use, and there was still dried mud on the floor mats from a volunteer construction project 2 weekends earlier. Olivia used to complain that a man with my salary should drive something more impressive. I always answered the same way. A vehicle only needs to take me where I am going. She never understood that I was talking about much more than a truck. Traffic moved slowly along Starrow Drive, giving me more time than I wanted with my own thoughts. I remembered meeting Olivia 12 years earlier at a charity fundraiser near the harbor. She loved my quiet confidence. I admired her ambition. Back then we believed success meant building a life together instead of competing for attention. Somewhere along the way those definitions changed. Expensive dinners replaced meaningful conversations. Social status became more important than shared dreams. The woman who once celebrated every small achievement slowly began measuring people by the numbers attached to their names. Nathan arrived at exactly the right moment. He looked successful. He talked loudly about private clubs, investment opportunities, and luxury vacations. He wore designer watches large enough for strangers to notice across a room. Compared to him, I probably seemed ordinary. That illusion had cost me nothing because I had never tried to correct it. My phone vibrated as I stopped at a red light. Claire had sent a single message. Phase 1 has begun. I placed the phone face down without replying. She already knew there would be no celebration. This was never about revenge fueled by anger. It was about allowing choices to reach their natural consequences. By the time Olivia realized what had truly begun outside that courthouse, every decision she believed had secured her future would quietly begin pulling in the opposite direction, and neither she nor Nathan would understand why every door they expected to open suddenly started closing. I drove straight to my office instead of going home. The headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a quiet glass tower overlooking the Charles River, yet almost nobody inside the building knew who I really was. The directory listed me as Senior Strategic Advisor, a title I had chosen years earlier because it attracted less attention than founder and executive chairman. Public recognition had never interested me. Freedom did. Claire was already waiting outside my office when I stepped off the elevator. She handed me a fresh cup of black coffee without asking whether I wanted one. She already knew the answer. "The preliminary reports are ready," she said calmly. I nodded and followed her inside. Floor-to-ceiling windows filled the room with afternoon sunlight, reflecting across shelves lined with industry awards that carried the company's name, but never mine. Olivia used to joke that I had no ambition because I refused magazine interviews, television appearances, or business conferences. She believed successful men needed to be seen. I believed successful businesses needed to survive. Those are very different goals. Claire placed several folders across my desk. None of them mentioned Olivia or Nathan by name. Instead, they contained summaries of investment partnerships, vendor agreements, private equity positions, and financing structures connected to companies throughout New England. Most people think wealth sits inside bank accounts. Real wealth rarely does. It lives inside relationships, contracts, trust, and patience built over decades. Claire quietly opened the first folder. Phase 1 notifications have already been delivered, she said. No direct action has been taken against either individual. We have only exercised existing contractual rights. That was exactly what I wanted. No revenge. No shortcuts. No bending the law. Every decision would remain completely legal and ethically defensible. I leaned back and looked through the window toward the river. 12 years earlier, I had met Olivia while my company was still expanding across the Northeast. She fell in love with the version of me who wore simple jackets, drove practical vehicles, and never discussed money at dinner. I never lied to her. She simply stopped asking questions once she assumed she already knew every answer. During the early years of our marriage, she often teased me about working late with Claire. I always laughed because the truth was wonderfully boring. Claire had worked beside me since the company employed fewer than 20 people. She knew every acquisition, every merger, every crisis, and every recovery. She had helped build the business one careful decision at a time. Trust like that cannot be purchased. It has to be earned. About an hour later, my phone vibrated. The caller identification displayed Nathan Cole. I watched it ring until the screen went dark. A few seconds later, another call arrived. This time it was Olivia. I let that one go unanswered as well. Claire looked up from her tablet, but said nothing. No calls, I said quietly. Not yet. She nodded once and returned to work. Late that afternoon, she forwarded a confidential market update. One investment group had unexpectedly postponed negotiations with Nathan's technology company. Another lender requested additional financial documentation before releasing funds for his newest expansion. Small developments. Ordinary developments. The kind of business decisions that happened every day. Separately, they meant almost nothing. Together, they formed the first gentle movement of a much larger tide. As evening settled over Boston, I walked through the nearly empty office, stopping briefly beside an old framed photograph taken during our first year in business. 23 employees stood together wearing construction helmets and smiling proudly after completing our first major commercial project. Looking at that picture reminded me why I had always protected what we built so carefully. It had never been about proving anyone wrong. It had always been about creating something strong enough to outlive every temporary storm. Outside my office, Claire turned off the lights and quietly said, "Tomorrow will be different." I looked once more toward the city skyline before answering. Tomorrow they will notice something has changed. They still will not know why. The next morning, Boston woke beneath a blanket of low-gray clouds. But inside my office, the atmosphere remained remarkably calm. Claire entered exactly at 7:30 carrying the daily briefing, placing the folders on the conference table with the same steady professionalism she had shown for more than a decade. "Several overnight developments," she said. "All expected." I walked toward the windows overlooking the Charles River before. Opening the first report, Nathan's company had postponed a highly publicized expansion event scheduled for Friday. The official statement blamed changing market conditions. That explanation sounded reasonable because it was true. Markets change every day. The difference was that the largest institutional investor behind the project had quietly exercised an exit clause written into the agreement years earlier. They had every legal right to do so. The decision simply happened to arrive at an unfortunate moment for Nathan. Claire opened another folder. The Harbor Ridge acquisition has also been suspended. I remembered that project well. My investment group had financed the original land purchase nearly 4 years earlier through a network of private partnerships. Nathan never knew who stood behind those funds because he had only dealt with intermediaries. That was intentional. The strongest structures are usually the ones nobody notices until they disappear. My phone buzzed again. 3 missed calls from Olivia. 2 messages followed. The first read, "Nathan says one of his investors suddenly backed out. Did you hear anything?" The second arrived 10 minutes later. "Please answer. This feels strange." I looked at the screen for several seconds before locking the phone without replying. Claire noticed, but remained silent. She understood that every unnecessary conversation created opportunities for emotion to replace judgment. Around 9 that morning, our general counsel joined us for a scheduled compliance meeting. Every document Claire had prepared was reviewed line by line. Every contractual action had been verified weeks earlier, long before my divorce became final. That was another lesson business had taught me. Never build decisions around anger. Build them around preparation. By lunchtime, another update appeared. 2 regional banks had requested additional audits before extending Nathan's existing credit facilities. Nothing dramatic. No accusations. Simply routine financial caution triggered by changing investment conditions. The reports reminded me of a line my father often repeated when I was young. Strong buildings never collapse because of one missing brick. They fail after years of hidden weaknesses. Nathan believed money alone created security. He had never learned the difference between borrowing influence and earning it. Late that afternoon, Claire entered my office holding a small envelope. This arrived by courier. Inside was an invitation to an exclusive charity gala scheduled for the following week. Nathan's company had been selected as one of the featured corporate sponsors. Claire looked at me carefully. "Would you like to decline?" I smiled faintly. "No. We will attend." She nodded once, already understanding why. Some truths reveal themselves more effectively in public than behind closed doors. Before leaving for the evening, Claire paused at my office door. "There is one more update," she said. "Nathan personally contacted 4 different investment firms today. None agreed to meet." I closed the final folder and looked once more across the Boston skyline as evening lights slowly appeared throughout the city. They still believed unfortunate timing explained everything happening around them. They had not yet realized that timing is rarely an accident when someone has spent years quietly building the foundation beneath an entire market. The first cracks were finally visible. Soon they would begin searching for whoever had caused them, never imagining they had been standing across from that person for years while mistaking patience for weakness. After the gala, the city seemed unusually quiet, as though Boston itself had decided to stop celebrating for a while. I left through the private entrance with Claire, while guests continued discussing the unexpected changes to the evening schedule. Nobody spoke about scandal because there was none. They spoke about uncertainty, and in the financial world, uncertainty travels faster than any headline. The following morning, Claire arrived carrying a single folder instead of the usual stack. "There is only one report worth reading today," she said as she placed it on my desk. Inside were summaries of overnight developments. Nathan's board of directors had called an emergency meeting. 2 independent directors requested immediate reviews of pending acquisitions. 1 institutional shareholder formally questioned the company's liquidity projections. Everything happened exactly as corporate governance was designed to function. When confidence weakens, responsible people ask difficult questions. My phone rang before I finished the second page. "Olivia." This time I answered. There was a long silence before she finally spoke. "Can we meet?" Her voice sounded exhausted, stripped of the certainty I remembered from only a week earlier. "What do you need?" I asked calmly. "I just want to understand what is happening." I looked across my office toward the river before answering. "Some things take years to build, Olivia. They can change very quickly once trust disappears." She hesitated. "Is this because of us?" I closed the folder without raising my voice. "No. This is because every business lives on confidence, not assumptions." She wanted another answer, but none came. After a few more quiet seconds, the call ended. Claire looked up from her tablet. "She still believes this is personal." I nodded slowly. "Because she has never seen how markets actually work." Around noon, another confidential briefing arrived from our legal department. Several suppliers had officially reduced credit terms with Nathan's company. A logistics partner postponed a nationwide rollout until additional guarantees could be provided. Individually, those decisions appeared routine. Together, they created pressure that could not be ignored. Claire placed another document beside the first. "There is something else." The report summarized Nathan's emergency meetings from the previous evening. According to reliable sources, he insisted someone was deliberately sabotaging his business. His executives disagreed. They pointed toward declining investor confidence, aggressive expansion, and unrealistic financial assumptions made long before recent events. Reading those pages reminded me why successful organizations survive difficult seasons. Healthy companies tell the truth before circumstances force them to. Late that afternoon, my private line rang again. This time the caller was Daniel Foster, chairman of one of our oldest investment partners. I heard. You attended the gala, he said warmly. Interesting evening. I smiled slightly. Business rarely follows our schedules. He laughed quietly before his tone became more serious. Nathan requested another meeting this morning. The board voted unanimously to decline. I thanked him for the update before ending the call. Claire looked toward me. Phase 3, she asked. I considered the question carefully. No additional action. She seemed mildly surprised. Nothing. I shook my head. Momentum is doing the work now. We do not need to interfere with what reality is already revealing. As evening settled across the skyline, I stood alone in my office watching the lights appear one building at a time. Somewhere across the city, Nathan was still searching for the invisible hand pushing against him. He would spend countless hours examining competitors, investors, regulators, and market conditions. The answer would never appear on any report because he was asking the wrong question. The problem had never been who was taking opportunities away from him. The problem was that he had mistaken borrowed credibility for his own, and now that borrowed foundation was quietly returning to the people who had built it in the first place. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Monday morning inside a 40-story office tower overlooking Boston Harbor. Nathan had spent the entire weekend trying to stabilize his company, calling investors, lenders, and advisors in the hope that one reassuring conversation might reverse the growing uncertainty. Instead, every conversation ended the same way. People thanked him for his time, promised to remain in contact, and politely delayed every important decision. Confidence had not disappeared overnight. It had simply stopped moving in his direction. Claire entered my office shortly after 8, carrying the final agenda for our own quarterly board meeting, which happened to begin only one floor above Nathan's. The timing was not arranged for dramatic effect. Both meetings had been scheduled months before anyone filed for divorce. Our directors have all arrived, she said. So have several institutional partners. I adjusted my jacket and followed her toward the executive elevator. As the doors opened on the 39th floor, familiar faces greeted me with warm handshakes and quiet conversations. Some had invested beside me for more than 20 years. Others had joined our network more recently, but all of them understood the same principle. Trust compounds just as reliably as capital. Halfway through our meeting, Claire's phone vibrated softly. She glanced at the screen before placing it face down beside her notebook. During a short break, she quietly leaned toward me. Nathan's board has requested an additional hour. Their discussions are becoming difficult. I simply nodded. Difficult conversations are unavoidable whenever expectations collide with reality. Our meeting resumed with presentations on infrastructure expansion, scholarship funding through our charitable foundation, and long-term investment strategies. Every proposal received thoughtful discussion because our directors were planning years ahead instead of reacting to today's headlines. Shortly before noon, the chairman concluded the session and thanked everyone for another successful quarter. As the directors began leaving the room, one of our senior partners smiled at me. There is another meeting downstairs that could probably use your experience. I smiled politely without answering. Experience cannot help people who refuse to understand the lessons standing in front of them. Claire and I stepped into the elevator together. When the doors opened on the 38th floor, we found the reception area unusually crowded. Attorneys, financial advisors, and board members stood in small groups speaking quietly. Nathan emerged from the conference room at that exact moment. His tie was slightly loosened, and the confidence that once seemed permanent had been replaced by visible exhaustion. He looked directly at me before his eyes shifted toward Claire. Recognition slowly spread across his face. You, he said quietly. You are Ethan's assistant. Claire answered with her usual calm professionalism. Yes, I am. Nathan frowned. Then why do people upstairs keep referring to him as chairman? Before either of us responded, the elevator opened again behind us. Daniel Foster stepped out with 2 additional directors and smiled warmly. Ethan, the board approved everything unanimously. Congratulations, Mr. Chairman. The hallway fell completely silent. Nathan stared at Daniel, then back at me, as though trying to fit together pieces of a puzzle that had never made sense. Olivia stepped out of the conference room a moment later and stopped walking the instant she heard the title. Her expression changed from confusion to disbelief. She looked from my face to Claire, then toward the executives, shaking my hand with effortless familiarity. Nobody needed to explain anything. The truth had finally revealed itself without a single accusation. Nathan swallowed slowly before asking the only question left. You built all of this. I met his eyes without anger or satisfaction. It was never hidden. You simply never thought it was worth looking beyond appearances. No one spoke after that. Sometimes the loudest moment in a person's life arrives in complete silence, when every assumption they trusted quietly collapses under the weight of a single undeniable truth. Claire and I left the 38th floor without another word, but I knew the silence behind us would not last. Truth has a way of demanding conversations that people spend years trying to avoid. By the time I reached my office, my phone already displayed 6 missed calls from Olivia. I placed it face down on my desk and continued reviewing the quarterly reports waiting for my signature. Business had never paused during my marriage, and it certainly would not pause after my divorce. About an hour later, Claire knocked softly before entering. She is downstairs, she said. She asked whether you would spare 10 minutes. I looked out across the Charles River for a long moment before answering. Send her up. Olivia entered my office slowly, almost hesitating at every step. She looked around the room as though seeing it for the first time, noticing the photographs with governors, university presidents, charity directors, and international business leaders displayed quietly along one wall. During our marriage, she had visited this office only twice, always assuming it belonged to someone else more important. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, she looked toward me with tired eyes. Why did you never tell me? I folded my hands together before answering. You never asked. She lowered her head. I thought I knew who you were. I smiled sadly. You knew the part of me that came home every evening. You never cared about understanding the rest. Tears slowly formed in her eyes. Everything is falling apart, she whispered. Nathan's board removed him as chief executive this morning. Investors are leaving. Banks are refusing new financing. He says someone destroyed his future. I remained quiet for several seconds. Nobody destroyed his future. Decisions have consequences. Markets respond to confidence. Contracts follow facts. She looked at me carefully. Did you do this? I answered honestly. I never asked anyone to break the law. I never asked anyone to betray a contract. I only instructed my team to stop protecting people who had chosen a different path. Olivia sat silently absorbing those words. She understood enough about business to realize what they meant. For years, my investment network had quietly opened doors, introduced opportunities, and provided credibility to companies that earned our confidence. Once that confidence disappeared, those advantages disappeared with it. I thought you were letting me go because you did not care anymore, she finally admitted. No, I said gently. I let you go because love without respect eventually becomes resentment. I refuse to live that way. She covered her face for a moment before taking a slow breath. If I could go back. I stopped her with a small shake of my head. Everyone wants another chance after they finally understand the lesson. Life rarely works that way. The room fell silent again. Outside the windows, the afternoon sun reflected across the river, filling the office with warm light that somehow made the conversation feel even more honest. Olivia stood and looked toward the city skyline before speaking one last time. I spent years chasing someone who looked successful while completely overlooking the man who had quietly built success with integrity. I did not answer because there was nothing left to add. She walked toward the door before stopping beside Claire, who had been waiting respectfully outside. I owe you an apology too, Olivia said softly. I always assumed you were just his assistant. Claire smiled kindly. I have always been exactly what Mr. Brooks needed me to be. Olivia nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind those words, then quietly left. As the office door closed behind her, Claire turned toward me. Do you think she finally understands? I looked once more across the city that had witnessed every chapter of my journey. She understands now, I said quietly. The difficult part is accepting that understanding sometimes arrives after the opportunity to change the outcome has already passed. 1 year later, the city looked exactly the same. Yet my life had quietly become something entirely different. Every morning, I still arrived at the office before 8, greeted the security team by name, accepted a cup of black coffee from Claire, and reviewed reports before the rest of the executive floor came alive. Success had never changed my routine because routine was the reason success lasted. Our company continued expanding across the Northeast, but the accomplishment that brought me the greatest satisfaction had nothing to do with quarterly earnings. The charitable foundation we established after our largest infrastructure project had doubled the number of scholarships awarded to first-generation college students. Community health programs received additional funding, and several neighborhoods finally welcomed the affordable housing developments we had spent years planning. Those projects reminded me why I started building businesses in the first place. Wealth means very little if it never improves another person's life. Nathan slowly disappeared from the financial headlines. After stepping away from his company, he accepted responsibility for several poor strategic decisions that had weakened investor confidence long before everything else unraveled. No scandal followed him. No dramatic public disgrace unfolded. He simply became another executive whose ambitions had grown faster than the foundation supporting them. Olivia also rebuilt her life, although in a much quieter way. Several months after leaving my office, she accepted a position with a nonprofit organization that helped families recover from financial hardship. One afternoon, she sent a handwritten note thanking me for treating her with dignity even after everything that happened. She wrote that losing the life she thought she wanted had forced her to discover the values she should have protected all along. I never replied because gratitude does not always require another conversation. Sometimes allowing people to continue moving forward is the greatest kindness possible. On a warm spring afternoon, Claire and I attended the opening ceremony for a new community education center funded entirely through our foundation. Children laughed across the playground while parents toured classrooms that would soon welcome hundreds of students. As local leaders gathered for photographs, one reporter approached and asked the same question I had heard many times throughout my career. "Mr. Brooks, what is the most valuable lesson business has taught you?" I smiled for a moment before answering. The strongest investments are never measured only in dollars. They are measured by the trust people choose to place in you every single day. Claire smiled quietly because she had heard that answer before. She knew it was more than a business philosophy. It had become the principle guiding every important decision in my life. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I stood alone in my office watching the lights reflect across the Charles River. 12 years of marriage had ended with a signature inside a courthouse, yet the story had never truly been about divorce. It had been about character revealed under pressure. People often believe power comes from taking something away from others. My experience taught me the opposite. Real power comes from building something so meaningful that it continues standing even after people choose to walk away. I thought back to the quiet words I had spoken outside the courthouse on the day my marriage officially ended. At the time, they sounded like the beginning of revenge. Looking back, they were actually the beginning of accountability. I never took everything from anyone. I simply stopped allowing my work, my reputation, and my trust to support people who no longer valued them. Everything that followed grew naturally from that single decision. As the last lights faded across the skyline, I picked up my briefcase, turned off the office lights, and walked toward the elevator with complete peace. In the end, the greatest victory was never watching someone else lose. It was discovering that integrity remains the only fortune no one can ever take away.